So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you tuning in from and what time it is for you. Deep in the heart of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges like ghostly fingers, there exists a darkness that historians have deliberately buried. These aren't your typical mountain folk stories passed down through generations around crackling fires. These are documented accounts of families so ruthless, so calculating in their violence, that even federal marshals crossed themselves before entering their territories. For over a century, three bloodlines carved out kingdoms of terror in America's most remote valleys. They operated beyond the reach of law, beyond the boundaries of human decency, and beyond anything you'll find in your history textbooks. What you're about to discover has been systematically erased from official records, hidden in sealed court documents, and whispered about only in the darkest corners of Appalachian memory. Before we descend into these forgotten hollows, where screams echoed off limestone walls and entire families vanished without explanation, hit that subscribe button and prepare yourself for stories that will fundamentally change how you think about American history. Because what lurks in these mountains makes the most violent crime families look like Sunday school teachers. Today, we're unveiling the three deadliest Appalachian dynasties that federal agents prayed they'd never encounter. Families whose very names were spoken like curses, whose territories were marked on maps with warnings that even seasoned lawmen heeded. These weren't just criminals, they were architects of systematic terror who transformed entire regions into their personal hunting grounds. The first family we're exploring controlled a network of caves so extensive that entire search parties disappeared trying to map them. The second dynasty perfected psychological warfare tactics that would make modern interrogators pale, and the third bloodline developed methods of disposal so efficient that bodies were never found, leaving only haunting questions that remain unanswered to this day. What makes these families particularly terrifying isn't just their body count, though that number will shock you. It's the calculated precision with which they operated, the generational knowledge they passed down, and the systematic way they eliminated anyone who threatened their reign. These weren't random acts of mountain justice. These were carefully orchestrated campaigns of terror that lasted decades. The Blackwood dynasty dominated the treacherous terrain of eastern Tennessee from 1894 to 1943. Led by the calculating patriarch Jeremiah Blackwood, this family understood that true power came not from brute force alone, but from controlling information, resources, and most importantly, fear itself. What set the Blackwoods apart from other violent mountain clans was their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and their ability to weaponize the very landscape against their enemies. Jeremiah arrived in the Cumberland Mountains as a young man fleeing murder charges in Virginia. Unlike other fugitives who simply hid in the wilderness, Jeremiah studied the terrain with military precision. He mapped every cave system, every hidden trail, every natural fortress that the ancient mountains provided. Within 5 years, he had established a network of informants, safe houses, and supply caches that stretched across 3 counties. The family's primary stronghold was a limestone cave system known locally as Devil's Throat, located in a valley so remote that even experienced mountain guides refused to venture there after sunset. The caves extended for miles underground, with chambers large enough to hold entire communities. Jeremiah transformed this natural fortress into something resembling an underground city, complete with workshops, storage areas, and holding cells carved directly into the living rock. What made the Blackwood operation particularly sinister was their recruitment strategy. Rather than simply terrorizing local communities, they identified individuals with specific skills: blacksmiths, doctors, teachers, even clergy, and gave them an ultimatum: join the family or watch their loved ones disappear. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated empire building. By 1900, the Blackwoods had essentially created their own civilization hidden beneath the Tennessee mountains. The family's signature method of control involved what they called the demonstration. When someone crossed the Blackwoods or failed to pay their tribute, they wouldn't simply kill the offender. Instead, they would stage elaborate public displays designed to traumatize entire communities into submission. Witnesses described scenes so disturbing that many refused to speak about them even decades later. Bodies would be found arranged in ways that conveyed specific messages, often incorporating elements of local folklore and superstition to maximize psychological impact. Perhaps most chilling was their record-keeping system. Federal agents, who eventually raided the caves in 1943, discovered meticulously maintained ledgers documenting every transaction, every death, every act of intimidation spanning nearly 50 years. These weren't chaotic mountain savages, they were organized criminals who understood the power of documentation and systematic approach to violence. The Blackwood children were raised from birth to continue the family legacy. They received education in traditional subjects, but also intensive training in tracking, wilderness survival, interrogation techniques, and what family members euphemistically called problem solving. By adolescence, each child had to prove their loyalty through increasingly violent initiation rituals that bonded them permanently to the family's dark mission. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory. They maintained business relationships with corrupt officials in 4 states, operated smuggling routes that connected to criminal networks as far away as Chicago, and even had informants within federal law enforcement agencies. When Prohibition began, the Blackwoods were perfectly positioned to become major players in the illegal alcohol trade, using their existing infrastructure to distribute moonshine across the eastern United States. Local communities lived in constant terror of the Blackwood name. Parents used stories of the family to frighten children into obedience. Traveling merchants would pay tribute rather than risk crossing Blackwood territory. Even other criminal families avoided the region, understanding that the Blackwoods viewed any competition as grounds for elimination. The family's downfall began during World War II, when their draft-dodging activities attracted unwanted federal attention. A massive joint operation involving FBI agents, federal marshals, and military personnel surrounded Devil's Throat in March 1943. The siege lasted 6 days, with explosive charges used to seal cave entrances and smoke used to flush out defenders. When federal agents finally entered the cave system, they discovered an underground complex that defied belief. The main chamber contained what appeared to be a primitive courthouse, where the Blackwoods had conducted their own trials and executions. Hundreds of personal items, Watches, jewelry, clothing were cataloged as evidence, representing victims whose bodies were never recovered. Most disturbing were the detailed maps showing the locations of what investigators believed were mass burial sites scattered across the region. Jeremiah Blackwood himself was never captured. Federal agents found evidence suggesting he had escaped through a previously unknown tunnel system that extended for miles underground. Some local legends claim he survived until the 1950s, living as a hermit in the deepest caves, occasionally emerging to check on hidden caches of weapons and supplies. Others insist he died during the siege, his body lost in the labyrinthine tunnels that became his tomb. The Blackwood legacy didn't end with the federal raid. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, unsolved disappearances in the region followed patterns remarkably similar to the family's historical methods. Federal investigators suspected that surviving family members continued operating, possibly training new generations in the traditional Blackwood techniques. Several cold cases from this period remain open, with evidence suggesting the involvement of individuals with intimate knowledge of the original family's methods. Modern spelunkers and cave explorers still occasionally discover evidence of the Blackwood presence, hidden caches of weapons, coded messages carved into cave walls, and primitive living spaces carved deep into the limestone suggest that the family's underground empire was even more extensive than investigators realized. Some chambers remain unexplored, sealed by rockfalls that may have been deliberately triggered to hide evidence or create permanent tombs for the family's darkest secrets. The psychological impact of the Blackwood dynasty extended far beyond their immediate victims. They fundamentally altered the culture of fear in Appalachian communities, creating a legacy of suspicion and silence that persists to this day. Their systematic approach to violence and control became a template that other criminal families would study and adapt, spreading their influence far beyond the Tennessee mountains where it originated. What makes the Blackwood story particularly haunting is how completely they disappeared from official history. Despite decades of systematic violence, despite federal investigations, despite hundreds of victims, their story exists primarily in sealed court records and the fading memories of elderly mountain residents who still speak their name in whispers. The second family dynasty that carved terror into Appalachian history was the Grimm bloodline, whose reign of psychological warfare terrorized the coal mining regions of West Virginia from 1902 to 1951. Unlike the Blackwoods, who relied on physical intimidation and underground fortresses, the Grimms understood that the human mind could be turned into its own prison. They perfected techniques of mental manipulation so sophisticated that victims would often confess to crimes they never committed, betray their own families, or simply walk into the wilderness, never to return. The Grimm patriarch, Ezra Grimm, arrived in the coal fields as a traveling preacher in 1902, but his true background was far more sinister. Federal investigators later discovered he had been expelled from a seminary in Ohio for conducting unauthorized experiments on fellow students, experiments that left several participants permanently psychologically damaged. Ezra possessed an uncanny ability to read people's deepest fears, their hidden shames, their most vulnerable psychological pressure points. He could identify a person's breaking point within minutes of conversation. What made the Grimms particularly dangerous was their understanding of community psychology. They didn't operate as isolated criminals, but embedded themselves deeply within local social structures. Ezra became a respected religious leader. His children married into prominent families, and his grandchildren were often the most popular students in their schools. From the outside, the Grimms appeared to be pillars of the community. But this integration was strategic, designed to give them unprecedented access to private information and vulnerable individuals. The family's base of operations was a compound disguised as a religious retreat center, built in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges that created natural acoustic properties. The buildings were designed with hidden chambers, secret passages, and rooms specifically constructed to amplify sounds in ways that would disorient and terrify occupants. Visitors reported hearing voices that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, whispers that followed them through corridors, and sounds that defied logical explanation. The Grimm method of control relied on what they called the breaking. Instead of simply killing their enemies, they would systematically destroy their victims' sense of reality. This process could take weeks or months, involving carefully orchestrated psychological pressure designed to make targets question their own sanity. Victims would receive anonymous letters containing intimate details about their private lives, find personal belongings moved or missing, and experience what appeared to be supernatural phenomena specifically tailored to their individual fears. The family maintained detailed psychological profiles on every resident within a 50-mile radius. These files contained information about family histories, personal relationships, financial troubles, health problems, and most importantly, psychological vulnerabilities. When someone needed to be eliminated or controlled, the Grimms would design a campaign of psychological warfare precisely calibrated to that individual's specific breaking point. Children were particularly vulnerable to Grimm manipulation. The family operated what appeared to be a charitable organization providing education and support to underprivileged mountain youth. In reality, this was a recruitment and training program designed to identify children with specific psychological profiles who could be molded into the next generation of Grimm operatives. These children were subjected to systematic psychological conditioning that erased their original identities and replaced them with absolute loyalty to the family. The Grimm's influence extended throughout the coal industry hierarchy. They had informants among mine foremen, company executives, union organizers, and government inspectors. This network allowed them to orchestrate mining accidents, labor disputes, and safety violations that served their purposes. When investigators looked into suspicious patterns of accidents or deaths, they would find evidence pointing to natural causes, mechanical failures, or simple human error. The Grimms had perfected the art of making murder look like misfortune. Local law enforcement proved completely ineffective against the Grimm operation. Sheriff's deputies would arrive to investigate complaints, only to find themselves questioning their own perceptions. Witnesses would recant their statements, evidence would disappear, and investigators would suffer mysterious accidents or psychological breakdowns that ended their careers. The family had turned the entire justice system into an extension of their psychological warfare machine. The Grimm children were raised in isolation, receiving their education within the compound from carefully selected tutors who were themselves products of the family's psychological conditioning. These children learned traditional subjects, but also received intensive training in human psychology, manipulation techniques, and what the family called mind crafting. By adolescence, each child could identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Perhaps most disturbing was the family's collection of what they called living trophies. These were individuals who had been psychologically broken so completely that they remained in the compound voluntarily, serving the family while believing they were there by choice. Federal agents, who eventually raided the compound in 1951, found dozens of these individuals, some of whom had been missing for decades. Many could no longer remember their original names or identities, having been so thoroughly reprogrammed that they genuinely believed they were willing members of the Grimm family. The psychological techniques developed by the Grimms were years ahead of their time. They understood concepts that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology until decades later: gaslighting, systematic desensitization, conditioning through intermittent reinforcement, and trauma bonding. They had essentially created their own science of mental manipulation, passing this knowledge down through generations like a dark family tradition. The family's downfall began when they made the mistake of targeting a federal judge's daughter in 1950. The young woman had been investigating reports of abuse at the Grimm Charitable Organization as part of her social work studies. After she disappeared, federal authorities launched the most comprehensive investigation in the region's history. What they discovered was a psychological warfare operation so sophisticated that it required experts from military intelligence and early CIA psychological operations divisions to fully understand. The federal raid on the Grimm compound revealed a horror that investigators struggled to document. The buildings contained rooms designed specifically for psychological torture, laboratories where the family conducted experiments on human subjects, and libraries filled with detailed case studies of their victims. Most chilling were the audio recordings, hundreds of hours of conversations between family members discussing their victims' psychological deterioration as if they were studying laboratory specimens. Unlike the Blackwoods, who left behind physical evidence of their crimes, the Grimms had perfected the art of destroying people without leaving traditional evidence. Many of their victims were still alive, but so psychologically damaged that they couldn't provide coherent testimony. Others had committed suicide, driven to self-destruction by systematic psychological pressure. Some had simply vanished, walking away from their lives in apparent psychological fugue states. The Grimm legacy proved particularly difficult to eradicate because their methods had infected the entire community. Survivors continued to exhibit symptoms of their conditioning for decades after the family's arrest. Children who had been exposed to Grimm influence grew up to perpetuate cycles of psychological abuse. The family had essentially created a psychological contagion that spread through generations, leaving scars that remained invisible but permanent. Even after the compound was seized and the family members arrested, strange incidents continued to plague the region. Residents reported receiving anonymous messages containing intimate details about their lives, experiencing technical malfunctions that seemed designed to create specific psychological effects, and suffering nightmares that felt more real than dreams. Some investigators theorized that the Grimms had trained sleeper agents who continued their work even after the family's official demise. The federal government classified most documents related to the Grimm investigation, partly to protect victims' privacy, but also because their psychological warfare techniques were considered too dangerous for public knowledge. Military intelligence agencies reportedly studied the family's methods, adapting their psychological manipulation techniques for use in interrogation and counterintelligence operations. The Grimm legacy thus extended far beyond their mountain stronghold, influencing the development of psychological warfare tactics that would be employed by government agencies for decades to come. What makes the Grimm story particularly unsettling is how they weaponized trust and community connection. Unlike traditional criminals who operated outside social structures, the Grimms infiltrated and corrupted the very institutions designed to protect and nurture human development. They turned churches into recruitment centers, schools into training facilities, and charitable organizations into hunting grounds. Their greatest achievement was making their victims complicit in their own destruction, creating a legacy of psychological trauma that continued to claim victims long after the family itself had been eliminated. The third and most terrifying dynasty to emerge from Appalachian darkness was the Crane family, whose methods of elimination were so thorough that they achieved something no other criminal organization had ever accomplished. They made people disappear so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all. While operating from the remote highlands of eastern Kentucky from 1889 to 1962, the Cranes didn't just kill their victims, they erased them from history itself. The Crane patriarch, Solomon Crane, possessed a background that federal investigators would later describe as deliberately obscured. What little they discovered suggested he had been a mortician's apprentice in Pennsylvania before fleeing south under mysterious circumstances, but Solomon brought with him knowledge that transformed the family into something far more sinister than typical mountain criminals. He understood anatomy, decomposition, and most importantly, how to make human remains vanish without leaving the slightest trace. What set the Cranes apart was their systematic approach to elimination. They didn't operate in bursts of violence like other mountain families. Instead, they developed what amounted to an industrial process for making people disappear. Their mountain compound, known locally as Crane's Hollow, was built specifically to facilitate this dark purpose. The buildings were constructed with hidden chambers, specialized drainage systems, and furnaces that burned at temperatures far exceeding what any legitimate purpose would require. The family's territory encompassed a region so remote that even experienced mountain guides avoided it instinctively. The landscape itself seemed to conspire with the Cranes' purposes. Natural sinkholes, abandoned mine shafts, and underground streams created perfect disposal sites that would never be discovered. But the family went beyond simply using these natural features. They modified them, expanding caverns, redirecting water flow, and creating what amounted to a network of natural crematoriums hidden throughout the mountains. Solomon's children were raised as apprentices in the family's Grimm trade. Each child specialized in different aspects of the elimination process. The eldest son, Marcus, became expert in what the family called acquisition, the art of making people vanish from their normal lives without triggering immediate searches. The daughter, Rebecca, mastered the psychological techniques needed to make victims compliant during their final hours. The youngest son, Caleb, developed an almost supernatural ability to erase all physical evidence of a person's existence. The Crane method began with careful surveillance and planning. They would study their targets for months, learning their routines, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. When the family decided someone needed to disappear, they would orchestrate circumstances that made the vanishing appear natural. A traveling merchant might be reported as having left town on schedule, though he had actually been intercepted miles away. A troublesome investigator might appear to have abandoned his case and relocated to another state, though he had never left the hollow alive. What made the Cranes particularly terrifying was their ability to make victims participate in their own erasure. Through a combination of psychological manipulation and carefully administered drugs derived from local plants, they could induce states of compliance that allowed them to extract detailed information about their victims' lives. The victim would provide names of contacts, locations of hidden assets, details about business arrangements, and most importantly, information about who might come looking for them. The family maintained meticulous records of their activities, but these weren't typical criminal ledgers. The Crane documentation system was designed to help them systematically eliminate all traces of their victims' existence. They kept detailed inventories of personal belongings, copies of important documents, and even samples of handwriting that could be used to forge letters explaining sudden departures or life changes. The Cranes' influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through a network of corrupt officials and intimidated locals who had been convinced that cooperation was their only path to survival. County clerks would alter birth and death records, postal workers would redirect mail, and even telegraph operators would modify messages to support the fiction that missing persons had simply relocated. The family had essentially created a conspiracy of silence that spanned multiple counties and involved dozens of unwilling participants. Local communities lived in a state of constant unease that was somehow worse than outright terror. People would simply vanish without explanation, leaving behind lives that were quickly erased as if they had never existed. Businesses would close, property would be quietly sold, and within weeks it would be as if the missing person had never been part of the community. This systematic erasure created a psychological atmosphere of unreality that affected everyone in the region. The Crane children were educated in subjects that served their dark purposes. They learned chemistry to understand decomposition and disposal, studied geology to locate suitable hiding places, and mastered forgery to create false documents. But they also received traditional education, allowing them to interact normally with the outside world while concealing their true nature. This duality made them particularly dangerous because they could move freely through society while maintaining their deadly skills. Perhaps most disturbing was the family's collection of what they called life records, detailed documentation of every person they had eliminated. These files contained photographs, personal belongings, and comprehensive biographies of victims. Federal investigators, who eventually discovered these records, realized they represented hundreds of people who had vanished over 7 decades, each one erased so completely that their disappearances had never been connected to criminal activity. The crane operation relied on a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. They knew that people disappeared from society naturally all the time, through accidents, suicides, voluntary relocations, or simple abandonment of previous lives. By mimicking these natural patterns, they could eliminate victims without triggering the kind of systematic investigation that would have exposed their activities. The family's downfall began during World War II, when their draft dodging activities attracted federal attention. Military investigators assigned to locate missing draftees discovered patterns that suggested something far more sinister than simple desertion. Young men who had been called for military service were disappearing at rates that defied statistical probability, and their families were receiving letters explaining sudden relocations or changed circumstances that investigation proved to be fabricated. The federal investigation that followed was unlike anything previously attempted in the region. Military intelligence officers, FBI agents, and federal marshals combined resources to penetrate the wall of silence that had protected the cranes for decades. They discovered that the family had been operating what amounted to a murder factory, eliminating people with industrial efficiency while maintaining the appearance of a normal mountain community. The evidence discovered during the 1962 raid on Cranes Hollow shocked even experienced federal investigators. Hidden chambers contained equipment designed specifically for body disposal, including furnaces that could reduce human remains to ash within hours. Chemical baths could dissolve organic matter completely, while mechanical devices could reduce bones to powder that could be scattered undetectably. The family had essentially created a system for making people vanish as if they had never existed. Most chilling were the detailed records showing that the Cranes had eliminated over 400 people during their 7-decade reign. These weren't random killings, but carefully planned executions of individuals who had posed threats to the family's operations or who possessed assets the family wanted to acquire. Each elimination was documented with clinical precision, including detailed accounts of disposal methods and steps taken to erase all evidence of the victim's existence. The psychological impact of the Crane revelations extended far beyond their immediate victims. Families across the region suddenly understood that missing relatives who had supposedly relocated or died in accidents might actually have been murdered and erased from existence. The discovery triggered hundreds of missing person investigations that had been dormant for decades, though few produced conclusive results due to the thoroughness of the Crane elimination process. Federal agents discovered that the family had maintained relationships with criminal organizations across the country, offering their elimination services to clients who needed problems permanently solved. This network had allowed them to operate profitably while maintaining their isolated mountain lifestyle. They had essentially created a business model based on making people disappear, serving clients who valued absolute discretion and permanent solutions. The Crane legacy proved particularly difficult to investigate because their methods had been so effective. Unlike other criminal families who left behind bodies and the evidence, the Cranes had perfected the art of making their crimes undetectable. Even after the family's arrest, investigators struggled to determine the full scope of their activities because so many victims had been erased so completely that their disappearances had never been reported as suspicious. The federal government classified most documents related to the Crane investigation, partly to protect ongoing investigations, but also because their elimination techniques were considered too dangerous for public knowledge. Military and intelligence agencies reportedly studied the family's methods, adapting their disposal techniques for use in covert operations where complete elimination of evidence was essential. What makes the Crane story particularly haunting is how they weaponized the very concept of existence itself. They didn't just kill people, they erased them from reality, making it as if they had never lived at all. This represented a form of murder that transcended physical death, extending into a realm of existential horror that challenged basic assumptions about identity, memory, and the permanence of human existence. The discovery of the Crane operation revealed something that federal investigators had never encountered before: a criminal organization that had achieved perfect crimes by making the crimes themselves disappear. They had created a system so efficient that it operated for over 70 years without detection, eliminating hundreds of people while maintaining the appearance of a normal mountain community. Even today, the full extent of the Crane legacy remains unknown. Federal investigators believe they discovered only a fraction of the family's victims, with many more disappearances likely remaining undetected. The psychological impact of their revelation continues to affect communities throughout Appalachia, where families still wonder about relatives who vanished decades ago under circumstances that seemed natural at the time but now appear suspect. The three families we've explored today, the Blackwoods with their underground empire, the Grimms with their psychological warfare, and the Cranes with their systematic erasure, represent something unprecedented in American criminal history. They weren't just violent criminals operating in remote areas. They were sophisticated organizations that created their own systems of justice, their own methods of control, and their own definitions of reality itself. These dynasties understood that true power came not from simple violence, but from the systematic application of fear, manipulation, and control. They studied their enemies, adapted to changing circumstances, and passed down their deadly knowledge through generations. Most importantly, they understood that the most effective crimes were those that appeared not to be crimes at all. The federal investigations that finally brought these families to justice required resources and expertise that had never before been applied to criminal cases in rural America. Military intelligence, psychological warfare specialists, and forensic experts had to develop new techniques specifically to understand and counter the sophisticated methods those families had perfected over decades of operation. What makes these revelations particularly disturbing is how completely these families had been erased from official history. Despite decades of systematic violence, despite federal investigations that required unprecedented resources, despite hundreds of victims whose lives were snuffed out or destroyed, their stories exist only in classified documents and the fading memories of elderly mountain residents who still refuse to speak their names aloud. The psychological scars left by these dynasties extend far beyond their immediate victims. They fundamentally altered the social fabric of Appalachian communities, creating legacies of fear and suspicion that persist to this day. Children in these regions grew up hearing whispered warnings about certain hollows, certain family names, certain places where the shadows seemed to move differently. These weren't mere superstitions, they were survival mechanisms passed down through generations who had learned that some dangers were too real to ignore. Modern investigators who have studied the declassified portions of these cases describe a level of sophistication that defies typical understanding of rural criminal organizations. These families had developed techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized by law enforcement or military intelligence for decades. They had essentially created their own sciences of terror, control, and elimination, operating with a precision that would have impressed professional intelligence agencies. The geographic isolation that initially protected these families also contributed to their eventual downfall. The same mountain barriers that kept law enforcement at bay also prevented the families from adapting quickly to changing times. When modern communication, transportation, and investigative techniques finally penetrated their strongholds, they were unprepared for the coordinated federal response that followed. But perhaps most chilling is the evidence suggesting that these three families weren't isolated phenomena. Federal investigators discovered correspondence between the dynasties, indicating they had maintained contact with each other and possibly with other criminal organizations throughout the region. There are hints of a broader network, a shadow society of mountain families who had developed their own codes, their own territories, and their own methods of mutual support. The techniques developed by these families didn't die with their arrest. Military and intelligence agencies studied their methods, adapting psychological warfare tactics pioneered by the Grimms, disposal techniques perfected by the Cranes, and organizational structures developed by the Blackwoods. In a twisted sense, these mountain criminals became unwitting contributors to the development of modern covert operations. Local communities struggled to rebuild after the revelation of these families' activities. How do you restore trust in a region where neighbors had been informants, where respected community leaders had been collaborators, where the very institutions designed to protect people had been corrupted or infiltrated? The healing process took generations, and some would argue it's still ongoing. The federal agents who investigated these cases often suffered long-term psychological effects from their exposure to such systematic evil. Many requested transfers to other assignments, unable to continue working in regions where they had witnessed the depths of human depravity. Some retired early, haunted by the knowledge of what they had uncovered in those mountain hollows. What's particularly unsettling is how normal these families appeared to outsiders. They attended church services, participated in community events, and maintained the appearance of typical mountain folk. This ability to blend seamlessly into society while conducting their dark activities made them far more dangerous than criminals who operated obviously outside social norms. The economic impact of these families' activities was staggering. Entire regions remained underdeveloped for decades because businesses refused to operate in areas known to be controlled by these dynasties. Tourism, mining, and timber operations all avoided territories where travelers and workers might simply vanish. The families had essentially created economic dead zones that took generations to recover. Modern forensic techniques have allowed investigators to re-examine some of the evidence from these cases, occasionally revealing new details about the family's activities. Ground-penetrating radar has located previously unknown burial sites. Chemical analysis has identified trace evidence that earlier investigators missed, and psychological profiling has provided new insights into the family's motivations and methods. The legal precedents established during the prosecution of these families influenced how federal authorities approached organized crime cases for decades afterward. The coordinated use of multiple agencies, the application of military intelligence techniques to civilian criminal investigation, and the development of witness protection programs all trace their origins to lessons learned during these mountain investigations. Some historians argue that these families represented a unique product of their time and place, a convergence of geographic isolation, economic desperation, and social upheaval that created perfect conditions for such organizations to flourish. Others contend that similar groups could emerge anywhere that law enforcement presence is weak and social institutions are strained. The stories of survivors from these families' territories reveal the long-term trauma inflicted on entire communities. Children who grew up during these reigns of terror often suffered from what would now be recognized as complex PTSD, exhibiting symptoms that affected their ability to form relationships, trust authorities, or feel safe in their own homes. Many families left the region entirely, unable to live with the memories of what they had witnessed. The religious impact was equally profound. Many communities lost faith in spiritual institutions that had been corrupted or infiltrated by these families. Churches that had served as centers of community life became suspect, their congregations scattered by revelations of collaboration with criminal dynasties. The healing of these spiritual wounds required the arrival of new clergy who could rebuild trust from the ground up. Educational systems in these regions were devastated by the revelation of how thoroughly they had been compromised. Schools that had served as recruitment centers for criminal families had to be completely restructured, their curricula examined for signs of indoctrination, their staff investigated for connections to the dynasties. Entire generations of children required specialized support to overcome the psychological conditioning they had received. The archaeological evidence left by these families continues to emerge decades after their elimination. Construction projects occasionally uncover hidden chambers, cached weapons, or human remains that provide new insights into their operations. These discoveries often trigger renewed investigations, though the passage of time has made prosecution impossible and identification of victims extremely difficult. What's most disturbing about these discoveries is how they reveal the true scope of these families' activities. Each new piece of evidence suggests that their operations were even more extensive than investigators realized, that their influence reached further than documented, and that their victim count was higher than officially recorded. The mountain landscape itself seems to be slowly revealing secrets that were meant to remain buried forever. The psychological techniques developed by these families have been studied by experts in cult behavior, hostage psychology, and trauma therapy. Their methods of indoctrination, control, and elimination provided insights into human psychology that contributed to our understanding of how ordinary people can be transformed into willing participants in systematic violence. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these stories is how they challenge our fundamental assumptions about justice, law, and civilization itself. These families operated for decades in a country that prided itself on democratic institutions and the rule of law, They created their own kingdoms of terror within the boundaries of the United States, governed by their own codes and answerable to no authority except their own twisted sense of justice. The mountain communities that hosted these dynasties were forever changed by their presence. Even today, visitors to these regions report an atmosphere of lingering unease, as if the violence and fear that once dominated these valleys had somehow soaked into the very soil. Local residents speak of places that still feel wrong, of hollows where the wildlife seems nervous, of ridges where the shadows fall differently than they should. Modern true crime enthusiasts who attempt to research these families often find themselves frustrated by the lack of available information. The federal classification of most documents, the deliberate destruction of evidence, and the reluctance of survivors to discuss their experiences have created an information vacuum that may never be filled. These stories exist primarily in whispered fragments of half-remembered testimonies and the sealed files of federal agencies. The legacy of these families extends beyond their immediate crimes into the realm of American mythology. They represent something primal and terrifying about the darkness that can flourish in isolated places, about the thin veneer of civilization that separates order from chaos. Their stories serve as reminders that monsters don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they smile from church pews and wave from front porches while conducting their dark business in the shadows. As we conclude our journey into these forgotten corners of American history, we're left with questions that may never be fully answered. How many other families operated in similar ways but were never discovered? What other secrets lie buried in the remote valleys and hidden hollows of Appalachia? And most disturbing of all, what conditions might allow such dynasties to emerge again? The three families we've explored today, the Blackwoods, the Grimms, and the Cranes, represent more than just criminal organizations. They embody the darkest possibilities of human nature when freed from the constraints of law, morality, and social responsibility. Their stories serve as warnings about what can happen when isolation, desperation, and opportunity converge in the wrong hands. These weren't random acts of violence or crimes of passion. They were systematic, generational campaigns of terror that transformed entire regions into kingdoms of fear. The fact that they operated for so long, so successfully, and so completely under the radar of law enforcement reveals disturbing truths about the limitations of justice and the fragility of the social order we take for granted. The mountain mist that still clings to these ancient ridges seems to whisper with the voices of the forgotten, the disappeared, the erased. In those whispers, we hear not just the stories of individual victims, but the collective trauma of communities that learn to live with monsters hidden in plain sight. These voices remind us that some stories are too important to forget, too dangerous to ignore, and too terrifying to fully comprehend. The federal agents who finally brought these dynasties to justice discovered something that chilled them more than the crimes themselves. Detailed correspondence between the three families revealing they had been sharing techniques, trading victims, and coordinating their territories for decades. The Blackwoods would send individuals who had proven resistant to physical intimidation to the Grimms for psychological breaking. The Grimms would transfer subjects who had been mentally destroyed but still required physical elimination to the Cranes. The Cranes would provide disposal services for both families when their own methods proved insufficient. This wasn't just criminal cooperation, it was a sophisticated network of specialized horror. Each family had perfected their own dark science, and together they had created a system of elimination so comprehensive that federal investigators struggled to understand its full scope. The mountain telegraph lines that connected their territories weren't just for communication, they were the nervous system of a murder machine that had operated across state lines for nearly a century. What makes this revelation particularly disturbing is the evidence suggesting these three families weren't the only participants in this network. Federal investigators discovered references to other family names, other territories, other specialists in the dark arts of human disposal. The Blackwoods mentioned collaborators in Virginia who specialized in making accidents look natural. The Grimms referenced contacts in North Carolina who could drive people to suicide without leaving evidence of manipulation. The Cranes wrote about partners in Tennessee who had perfected techniques for eliminating entire families without triggering investigations. The scope of this mountain murder network may have extended far beyond what investigators ever discovered. How many other families operated in similar ways but were never exposed? How many other dynasties perfected their own methods of systematic elimination while maintaining the appearance of normal mountain folk? The classified documents hint at a shadow society of criminal families who had divided the territories, shared techniques, and supported each other's operations for generations. Perhaps most chilling is the evidence that this network had begun adapting to modern times. Federal investigators found correspondence from the 1950s discussing the need to update their methods for an era of improved communication and transportation. The families were researching new disposal techniques, studying modern police procedures, and developing countermeasures against emerging investigative technologies. They weren't just relics of a lawless past, they were evolving predators preparing for a changing world. The psychological impact of these revelations extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Federal agents who worked these cases often requested transfers to other assignments, unable to continue operating in regions where they had witnessed such systematic evil. Many retired early, haunted by the knowledge of what they had uncovered in those mountain hollows. Some required extensive psychological counseling to process the reality of what human beings could do to each other when freed from the constraints of law and morality. Local communities struggled to rebuild after learning the truth about their neighbors, their leaders, their institutions. How do you restore trust in a region where the postmaster had been altering mail to cover up disappearances, where the county clerk had been falsifying records to erase victims from official documentation, where the local preacher had been identifying vulnerable congregation members for elimination? The healing process took generations, and some would argue it's still ongoing. The economic devastation was equally profound. Entire regions remained underdeveloped for decades because businesses refused to operate in areas known to be controlled by these dynasties. Tourism, mining, and timber operations all avoided territories where workers and travelers might simply vanish. The families had essentially created economic dead zones that took generations to recover, leaving communities impoverished and isolated long after the criminals themselves had been eliminated. Modern forensic techniques have allowed investigators to re-examine some evidence from these cases, occasionally revealing new details about the family's activities. Ground-penetrating radar has located previously unknown burial sites near the Blackwood cave systems. Chemical analysis has identified trace evidence of the grim psychological experiments in soil samples from their compound. Advanced decomposition studies have provided insights into the crane disposal techniques that help solve cold cases from other regions. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery is how these families' methods influenced the development of modern covert operations. Military and intelligence agencies studied their techniques, adapting psychological warfare tactics pioneered by the Grimms, disposal methods perfected by the Cranes, and organizational structures developed by the Blackwoods. In a twisted sense, these mountain criminals became unwitting contributors to the evolution of government black operations. The stories of survivors from these families' territories reveal trauma that affected entire generations. Children who grew up during these reigns of terror often suffered from what would now be recognized as complex PTSD, exhibiting symptoms that affected their ability to form relationships, trust authorities, or feel safe in their own homes. Many families left the region entirely, unable to live with the memories of what they had witnessed or the knowledge of what their neighbors had been capable of. Even today, visitors to these regions report an atmosphere of lingering unease, as if the violence and fear that once dominated these valleys had somehow soaked into the very landscape. Local residents speak of places that still feel wrong, of hollows where wildlife seems nervous, of ridges where shadows fall differently than they should. The mountain mist that clings to these ancient peaks seems to whisper with voices of the forgotten, the disappeared, the erased. Construction projects occasionally uncover hidden chambers, cached weapons, or human remains that provide new insights into these families' operations. Each discovery often triggers renewed investigations, though the passage of time has made prosecution impossible and identification of victims extremely difficult. The mountain landscape itself seems to be slowly revealing secrets that were meant to remain buried forever. What's most disturbing about these ongoing discoveries is how they reveal the true scope of these families' activities. Each new piece of evidence suggests their operations were even more extensive than investigators realized, that their influence reached further than documented, that their victim count was higher than officially recorded. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of systematic horror that operated on an industrial scale while maintaining the appearance of normal mountain life. The psychological techniques developed by these families have been studied by experts in cult behavior, hostage psychology, and trauma therapy. Their methods of indoctrination, control, and elimination provided insights into human psychology that contributed to our understanding of how ordinary people can be transformed into willing participants in systematic violence. This knowledge has been applied to understanding everything from terrorist recruitment to domestic abuse patterns. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these stories is how they challenge our fundamental assumptions about justice, law, and civilization itself. These families operated for decades within the boundaries of the United States, a country that prided itself on democratic institutions and the rule of law. They created their own kingdoms of terror, governed by their own codes answerable to no authority except their own twisted sense of justice. The federal classification of most documents related to these cases has created an information vacuum that may never be filled. These stories exist primarily in whispered fragments, half-remembered testimonies, and sealed files of federal agencies. The deliberate destruction of evidence, the reluctance of survivors to discuss their experiences, and the passage of time have combined to ensure that the full truth about these families may never be known. Modern true crime enthusiasts who attempt to research these dynasties often find themselves frustrated by the lack of available information. The few details that have emerged paint a picture so disturbing that many researchers abandon their investigations, unable to process the reality of what these families accomplished. Those who persist often report experiencing nightmares, paranoia, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seems to emanate from the very documents they're studying. The legacy of these families extends beyond their immediate crimes into the realm of American mythology. They represent something primal and terrifying about the darkness that can flourish in isolated places, about the thin veneer of civilization that separates order from chaos. Their stories serve as reminders that monsters don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they smile from church pews and wave from front porches while conducting their dark business in the shadows. As we close this investigation into America's most terrifying family dynasties, we're left with questions that may never be fully answered. The mountain hollows of Appalachia still hold secrets that would challenge our understanding of human nature, criminal organization, and the limits of evil itself. The mist that clings to these ancient ridges carries whispers of the forgotten, voices of those who disappeared into darkness so complete that their very existence was erased from history. These weren't random acts of violence or crimes of passion. They were systematic, generational campaigns of terror that transformed entire regions into kingdoms of fear. The fact that they operated for so long, so successfully, and so completely under the radar of law enforcement reveals disturbing truths about the limitations of justice and the fragility of the social order we take for granted. The three dynasties we've explored today, the Blackwoods with their underground empire, the Grimms with their psychological warfare, and the Cranes with their systematic erasure, represent more than just criminal organizations. They embody the darkest possibilities of human nature when freed from the constraints of law, morality, and social responsibility. Their stories serve as warnings about what can happen when isolation, desperation, and opportunity converge in the wrong hands. In those mountain valleys, where screams once echoed off limestone walls and entire families vanished without explanation, the silence now feels heavier than it should. The darkness seems deeper, the shadows move differently, and sometimes, on the coldest nights when the wind moves through the ancient peaks like labored breath, locals swear they can still hear faint voices calling from the hollows, not in pain or warning, but an invitation, because the mountains remember everything, and some hungers never truly die. If this journey into America's darkest family secrets left you questioning what other horrors might be hidden in our forgotten corners, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Our next investigation takes us to abandoned towns where entire populations vanished overnight, leaving behind evidence that government agencies are still trying to suppress. Trust me, What we discovered in those empty streets makes these Appalachian dynasties look like cautionary tales. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous predators are often the ones who know exactly how to blend in. Stay curious, but stay vigilant out there.